Handcuff her now, Nicole Hart snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin so sharply that conversations stopped mid-sentence and dozens of eyes turned toward a 16-year-old girl sitting quietly by the window. Aaliyah Brooks froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. She glanced around the first-class cabin of Flight 218 from Atlanta to Seattle, expecting someone else to react, someone else to realize there had to be a mistake. But nobody spoke. The flight attendants standing near the galley exchanged looks. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman across the aisle slowly removed her headphones. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Aaliyah sat perfectly still in seat 2A, her backpack tucked beneath the seat in front of her, her boarding pass folded neatly inside her phone case. She wore a gray hoodie, black leggings, and white sneakers that had seen better days. To most people, she looked like an ordinary teenager traveling alone. To Nicole Hart, the lead flight attendant, she looked like someone who did not belong. "Ma'am, I already showed my boarding pass," Aaliyah said softly. Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept it respectful. That only seemed to irritate Nicole more. "And I told you there is a problem," Nicole replied. "You need to cooperate." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Aaliyah felt dozens of strangers staring at her. She hated being the center of attention. Her father always told her that confidence was quiet, that dignity mattered most when people tried to take it away from you. So she sat up straight and tried to remain calm. But calm was becoming difficult. Two crew members moved closer. Their expressions were serious, almost rehearsed. One of them whispered something to Nicole. Nicole nodded. Whatever doubt had existed was gone now. Aaliyah's chest tightened. "What exactly is the problem?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Instead, Nicole folded her arms and looked down at her as though the answer should have been obvious. Around the cabin, whispers began spreading from row to row. Nobody knew what was happening, but everyone sensed the tension. Near the rear galley, a young trainee flight attendant named Emma Carter watched with growing concern. She had seen Aaliyah board earlier. She remembered the boarding pass scanning green. She remembered the gate agent smiling and wishing her a pleasant flight. Nothing about this situation made sense. Emma took a step forward, then stopped. Nicole was known for shutting people down. Challenging her rarely ended well. Meanwhile, Aaliyah looked out the window. The late afternoon sun reflected across the runway in streaks of gold. Families were settling into seats. Pilots moved through pre-flight procedures. Everything outside seemed normal. Inside the cabin, however, something had shifted. The atmosphere no longer felt like the beginning of a routine flight. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would change every person on board before the day was over. Aaliyah Brooks had always hated attention. 3 hours earlier, before the tension, before the whispers, before every eye in the cabin found its way to her seat, she had been standing at gate B14 with a paperback novel tucked beneath her arm and a message from her father glowing on her phone screen. "Safe flight, kiddo. See you tonight." That was all Marcus Brooks had written. No mention of board meetings. No mention of the company. No mention of the fact that reporters followed his every move whenever he appeared in public. To Aaliyah, he was simply Dad. The man who never missed a birthday. The man who taught her how to ride a bike. The man who always answered on the second ring, no matter how busy he was. She smiled at the memory and slipped the phone back into her pocket. At the gate, nobody had questioned her ticket. The boarding pass scanned green. The gate agent greeted her warmly and pointed her toward the jet bridge. Everything had been normal, ordinary, exactly the way she liked it. She boarded early, found her seat, stored her backpack, and settled beside the window. A middle-aged woman across the aisle smiled and asked if she was traveling for school. Aaliyah politely explained that she was visiting family. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Nothing about it seemed remarkable at the time. Yet now, sitting beneath the weight of suspicious stares, she found herself replaying those moments, searching for some clue that might explain why everything had changed. Nicole Hart remained standing near the aisle. Her posture was rigid. Her expression carried the certainty of someone who believed she had already reached a conclusion. Nearby passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody seemed to understand what rule had been broken. Nobody appeared willing to ask. Emma Carter continued watching from the rear of the cabin. The young trainee could feel her stomach tightening. During training, they had spent weeks discussing customer service, professionalism, and fairness. What she was seeing now did not resemble any of those lessons. It resembled something else. something she could not quite name. Aaliyah slowly folded her hands together in her lap. Her father had given her one piece of advice years earlier after a difficult day at school. Some people will decide who you are before you speak. Never let them decide who you become. At the time, she had been too young to fully understand what he meant. Sitting here now, she understood perfectly. The silence inside the aircraft felt heavier by the minute. Conversations had faded. Even the usual sounds of boarding seemed distant. The cabin was becoming a stage, and somehow Aaliyah had become the center of a story she never asked to join. Then a man seated several rows behind her stood up abruptly and began checking the overhead bins above his seat. His movements were hurried, nervous. He searched one compartment, then another. A flight attendant approached him and quietly asked if something was wrong. The man's answer was barely audible, yet the effect was immediate. The flight attendant's eyes widened. She turned toward Nicole. Within seconds, Nicole's expression hardened even further. Whatever concern had just entered the conversation, it was about to change everything. The man searching the overhead bins introduced himself as Richard Bennett, a technology consultant from Denver. His voice carried just enough frustration to draw attention without becoming disruptive. "My wallet is missing," he said. "It was right here when I sat down." The statement spread through the cabin faster than turbulence. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The missing wallet instantly became the most important thing on the aircraft. Nicole Hart stepped forward, her expression sharpening with purpose. "When was the last time you saw it?" she asked. Richard rubbed his forehead and pointed toward the overhead compartment. "About 20 minutes ago. I put my briefcase up there and checked my wallet before boarding finished." Nicole nodded slowly. Then her gaze moved across the rows. One seat at a time, one passenger at a time, until it stopped on Aaliyah Brooks. The pause lasted only a second, but everyone noticed it. Aaliyah noticed it too. Something in Nicole's eyes had changed. It was the look of someone who believed she had found an answer before asking a single question. "Did anyone move through this section after boarding?" Nicole asked another crew member. The woman hesitated. "A few passengers." Nicole's eyes remained fixed on Aaliyah. "Including her?" A chill moved through the cabin. Aaliyah sat perfectly still. "I went to the restroom before takeoff," she answered quietly. "Then I came back to my seat." Nicole folded her arms. "Interesting." The word landed like an accusation. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody had seen Aaliyah do anything suspicious. Nobody had heard evidence. Yet the atmosphere was already shifting. Emma Carter felt her stomach drop. She recognized the pattern unfolding in front of her. Questions were no longer being asked to find information. They were being asked to confirm a conclusion. Aaliyah looked around the cabin. She could feel the attention growing heavier. It reminded her of a science fair years earlier when a teacher had accused her of copying a project because it seemed too advanced for a middle school student. She remembered standing there while adults questioned her work without ever asking how hard she had studied. The memory returned now with uncomfortable clarity. Different place. Same feeling. Richard Bennett finally spoke again. "I'm not saying anyone took it. I just want to find it." His voice sounded reasonable, calm, but the damage had already begun. Nicole nodded while continuing to watch Aaliyah. "Of course, we are simply gathering information." Yet her actions suggested otherwise. She approached Aaliyah's row. Every step seemed deliberate. Every passenger watched. Aaliyah could hear the engines humming outside. She could hear seatbelts clicking. She could hear her own heartbeat. "Can you tell me why you were sitting alone in first class?" Nicole asked. The question hung in the air. Emma's eyes widened. Several passengers looked visibly uncomfortable. Even Richard Bennett frowned slightly. Aaliyah blinked in disbelief. "Because I bought a first-class ticket," she replied. Nicole's expression did not change. "Did you?" she asked. And just like that, the missing wallet was no longer the center of attention. Aaliyah was. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The question lingered above the cabin like a storm cloud waiting to break. Aaliyah Brooks stared at Nicole Hart, unsure whether she had actually heard those words correctly. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who had remained silent until now seemed surprised by what had just been asked. Aaliyah reached slowly into her pocket and removed her phone case. Tucked inside was the boarding pass she had used less than an hour earlier. "Yes," she said calmly. "I did." She handed it over. Nicole took the boarding pass and examined it for only a moment before lowering it again. It was valid. The seat number matched. The name matched. Everything matched. Yet the tension did not disappear. If anything, it became worse. Nicole's expression suggested that facts were now getting in the way of a story she had already decided to believe. Near the rear galley, Emma Carter finally stepped forward. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "I remember her boarding," Emma said. Several heads turned toward her immediately. Nicole looked annoyed. Emma swallowed hard but continued. "The gate scanner approved her ticket. I saw it myself." The young trainee's voice was not loud, but it carried through the suddenly quiet cabin. For the first time, doubt appeared on a few faces. A man across the aisle nodded slowly. A woman. Near the front glanced between Nicole and Aaliyah. The certainty that had been building began to crack. Nicole crossed her arms. "Nobody asked for your opinion, Emma." The words landed sharply. Emma felt her face grow warm, but she refused to step back. Something about the situation felt wrong. Not unusual. Wrong. There was a difference. Richard Bennett remained standing beside his seat. He looked increasingly uncomfortable with the attention focused on Aaliyah. "Look," he said, raising his hand slightly. "I just want my wallet found. I am not accusing anyone." Yet nobody seemed to hear him. The search for a missing wallet had somehow become a judgment of a 16-year-old girl. Aaliyah felt the weight of every stare pressing against her. She remembered another moment years earlier when she had been 11 years old at a bookstore in Charlotte. A clerk had followed her through 3 different aisles while ignoring every other customer. She had asked her mother afterward why it happened. Her mother had looked sad before answering. "Sometimes people see fear where there is none," she had said. Sitting in seat 2A now, Aaliyah finally understood what that meant. Emma took another careful step forward. "Maybe we should check the overhead bins again," she suggested, "or review where the passenger last used the wallet." It was a reasonable idea, a professional idea, yet Nicole barely acknowledged it. Her attention remained fixed on Aaliyah. The engines outside continued humming steadily. Boarding had nearly finished. But inside the aircraft, the real journey had not even begun. Because at that exact moment, another crew member hurried down the aisle carrying a small tablet. The look on her face suggested she had just discovered something important. Something that would push the entire situation in a dangerous new direction. The crew member carrying the tablet slowed as she approached Nicole Hart. Her expression was uncertain, the kind people wear when information does not match expectations. She leaned in and whispered something. Nicole listened carefully. Then she took the tablet and reviewed the screen herself. For a brief moment, the confidence in her face flickered, not enough for most passengers to notice. But Emma Carter saw it immediately. Nicole quickly locked the screen and handed the device back. Whatever she had read, she clearly did not want the cabin discussing it. "What does it say?" Richard Bennett asked. His voice was calm but firm. He seemed increasingly uncomfortable watching events spiral beyond the missing wallet. Nicole offered a professional smile that never reached her eyes. "We are still verifying information." The answer satisfied no one. Passengers exchanged skeptical glances. The atmosphere inside the cabin felt charged now, as though everyone could sense a turning point approaching. Aaliyah Brooks remained seated by the window. She had stopped trying to understand why this was happening. Instead, she focused on staying calm. Her father often said that panic clouds judgment. She repeated those words silently in her mind. Outside the aircraft, baggage carts rolled across the tarmac. Airport vehicles moved beneath the afternoon sun. Everything beyond the glass looked ordinary. Inside the cabin, however, the pressure kept building. Emma glanced toward the tablet one more time. She had only caught a glimpse of the display, but she was almost certain she recognized what it showed. Passenger records, seating assignments, verification data, the very information that should have settled the situation. If she was right, the records confirmed that Aaliyah belonged exactly where she was sitting. Yet somehow that was not ending the investigation. It was almost as if the investigation no longer needed facts to continue. A woman seated near the front finally spoke up. "This has gone far enough," she said. "The young lady has shown her ticket." Several passengers nodded in agreement. Another man added, "Either there is evidence or there is not." The comments spread through the cabin like small sparks. Confidence was beginning to shift away from the crew and toward the teenager sitting quietly by the window. Nicole noticed it too. Her posture stiffened. Control of the narrative was slipping. That was when another announcement crackled through the aircraft speakers. The captain informed passengers that Departure would be delayed briefly while an onboard matter was resolved. A collective groan moved through the cabin. Phones appeared. Text messages were sent. Curious travelers began recording details for family members waiting at their destinations. The situation was no longer private. It was becoming public. Emma felt a knot forming in her stomach. Every additional minute seemed to deepen the divide between what should have happened and what was happening. Then Richard Bennett suddenly checked his jacket pocket again. His expression changed. He reached inside carefully and pulled out a dark leather wallet. For a second, he simply stared at it. The entire cabin froze. "You found it?" someone asked. Richard looked embarrassed. "Apparently I did." Silence swept through the aircraft. A silence far heavier than any accusation. Because the missing wallet had just been found. But the suspicion it created was still hanging over only one person. The aircraft door remained open as airport personnel moved quietly along the jet bridge. Word of the incident had already traveled far beyond the cabin. Passengers continued exchanging whispers while phones glowed in their hands. The atmosphere felt different now. The certainty that had fueled the accusations was gone, replaced by uncertainty and unease. Nicole Hart stood near the front of the cabin trying to maintain control, but even she seemed aware that something had shifted. Then movement appeared beyond the aircraft door. Several airport managers entered first, their expressions serious. Behind them walked a man in a dark navy suit. He was tall, composed, and moving with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. Nobody in the cabin recognized him immediately. He was not accompanied by reporters or security details. There was no dramatic entrance. Yet the moment he stepped onto the aircraft, conversations began fading one by one. The man scanned the cabin without speaking. His eyes moved past the first row, then the second. They stopped when they reached seat 2A. Aaliyah Brooks looked up and froze. Relief washed across her face so suddenly that several nearby passengers noticed it. "Dad," she whispered. Marcus Brooks walked forward immediately. Every step seemed deliberate. Every expression around him seemed to change as he approached. He reached his daughter and knelt beside her seat. His voice was calm, but there was concern beneath every word. "Are you all right?" Aaliyah nodded slowly. "I'm okay now." Marcus studied her face for a moment. He noticed the tension she was trying to hide. He noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. He noticed the way she kept glancing around at the strangers who had spent the last hour judging her. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus stood and turned toward the cabin. The silence became absolute. Nicole stepped forward with a professional smile. "Sir, we have been handling an onboard matter." Marcus looked at her. Not angrily, not aggressively, simply looking. Yet something about his expression made her stop speaking. Nearby crew members exchanged nervous glances. Emma Carter felt her pulse quicken. She had no idea who Marcus Brooks was, but she could sense that his arrival mattered. One airport manager, standing near the entrance, appeared especially uncomfortable. Another avoided eye contact completely. The reactions did not go unnoticed by the passengers. Richard Bennett frowned as he watched. The woman across the aisle lowered her phone slightly. Everyone seemed to be waiting for an explanation. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was steady and controlled. "I received a call regarding my daughter." The words echoed through the cabin. "My daughter." Suddenly dozens of eyes shifted toward Aaliyah, then back to Marcus. The connection became clear. Yet the larger truth remained hidden. Nicole straightened her posture. "Sir, there appears to have been a misunderstanding." Marcus glanced toward Aaliyah once more before looking back at the crew. "Then I suggest we discuss exactly how that misunderstanding happened." No one answered. Because somewhere deep inside the aircraft, people were beginning to realize they had spent the entire afternoon questioning the wrong person. The question hung over the cabin like a weight nobody wanted to carry. Nicole Hart opened her mouth, searching for the right explanation, but every version sounded weaker than the one before it. Marcus Brooks waited patiently. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. The quiet confidence in his posture seemed to make the silence even heavier. One of the airport managers finally stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "we are reviewing everything that occurred before departure." The reaction was immediate. Several passengers looked at one another. Richard Bennett frowned. Emma Carter's eyes widened. Nicole's expression changed completely. The name had landed. Not everyone recognized it instantly, but the crew did. Marcus Brooks was not just a concerned father arriving at the gate. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Aerospace Holdings, one of the largest aviation technology companies in the country. His company supplied systems used by airlines across North America. Industry magazines featured him regularly. Business networks followed his acquisitions. Yet standing beside seat 2A, he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a father trying to understand how his daughter had become the center of a public humiliation. The realization spread through the cabin row by row. A passenger near the front quietly searched his phone. Within seconds, his eyes grew wide. Another passenger did the same. Whispers began moving through the aircraft. That is Marcus Brooks. The Marcus Brooks? No way. Nicole suddenly looked as though the floor beneath her had shifted. Every decision made during the last hour now seemed to return all at once. The accusations, the assumptions, the questions that had never been asked of anyone else. Marcus glanced toward Emma Carter. The trainee stood frozen near the galley. You spoke up for my daughter? He asked. Emma swallowed nervously. I only told the truth, sir. Marcus nodded once. That matters. Those two words carried more weight than any speech. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time all afternoon, someone had acknowledged what she had tried to do. Richard Bennett slowly stood from his seat. His face was filled with embarrassment. Mr. Brooks, I owe your daughter an apology. My wallet was never missing. I simply misplaced it. Aaliyah looked at him and offered a small nod. She did not appear angry. She appeared tired. Marcus noticed that immediately. He turned toward the crew again. My daughter did not ask for special treatment, he said calmly. She asked for the same treatment everyone else received. No one challenged him, because everyone knew he was right. The airport managers exchanged uneasy glances. They had already reviewed preliminary reports. They already knew what the passenger records showed. They already knew that concerns had continued long after the facts should have ended them. The problem was no longer a misunderstanding. The problem was judgment. Marcus looked around the cabin one final time. Every eye was on him now. Then he delivered a sentence so quietly that passengers leaned forward to hear it. The most important thing you reveal about yourself is how you treat people when you believe they cannot change your future. And in that moment, the crew realized the person they had underestimated all afternoon was never the chief executive officer standing before them. It had been the 16-year-old girl sitting by the window. No one spoke after that. The cabin sat in complete silence, the kind of silence that arrives when every excuse has already fallen apart. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of certainty. The silence that follows when facts become impossible to argue with and every attempt to reshape reality finally runs out of room. Nicole Hart lowered her eyes. The confidence that had carried her through the afternoon was gone. The certainty that had once guided every instruction she gave now felt distant, replaced by a growing awareness of how badly things had unfolded. Around her, crew members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with passengers and with one another. Some stared toward the floor. Others focused on meaningless tasks simply to avoid confronting the moment directly. The facts were no longer in dispute. The passenger records were clear. The boarding pass had always been valid. The wallet had never been stolen. Every explanation that once sounded convincing now felt painfully hollow. What had seemed like reasonable suspicion only hours earlier now appeared exactly as it was, an assumption built on appearances rather than evidence. One of the airport managers stepped forward holding a tablet. His expression was professional, but there was no hiding the seriousness of the moment. An internal review has already been initiated, he said. All reports, communications, and passenger statements will be included. The words echoed through the cabin. Passengers exchanged quiet looks. Several had witnessed everything from beginning to end. Others had only seen pieces of the story unfold. Yet all of them understood the same truth. What happened here was never really about a missing wallet. It was about assumptions. It was about deciding who belonged before learning who a person actually was. It was about confidence replacing verification and perception replacing facts. Emma Carter stood near the galley, still processing everything she had witnessed. The afternoon had begun as a routine flight, a normal boarding process, a normal workday. Yet somewhere along the way, a simple misunderstanding had transformed into something much larger. Marcus Brooks noticed her again and offered a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but it reminded her why she had spoken up. Not because she knew who Aaliyah's father was, Not because she expected recognition, because it was the right thing to do. In a situation where many people chose silence, she had chosen honesty. That choice now seemed more significant than ever. Aaliyah slowly gathered her backpack from beneath the seat. For the first time all afternoon, she looked relaxed. The tension that had followed her through the cabin seemed to lift little by little. Her shoulders were no longer rigid. Her breathing was steady. The uncertainty that had shadowed her expression since boarding had finally disappeared. Marcus placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Neither of them looked triumphant. They looked relieved. Relieved that the truth no longer needed defending. Relieved that the questions had finally ended. Relieved that what should have been obvious from the beginning had finally been acknowledged. Richard Bennett cleared his throat. I hope one day you can forgive all of us for staying quiet too long. His voice carried genuine regret. He wasn't speaking only for himself. Everyone in the cabin understood that. He was speaking for every passenger who had suspected something was wrong, but chose comfort over confrontation. Every witness who waited for someone else to act first. Every person who convinced themselves that staying uninvolved was the safest choice. Aaliyah considered his words. Then she offered a small smile. People make mistakes, she said. The important thing is what they do after they realize it. Several passengers nodded. Some looked away thoughtfully. Others stared out the windows, reflecting on moments in their own lives when they had remained silent while something unfair happened nearby. One businessman thought about a co-worker who had been unfairly blamed during a meeting years earlier. A woman near the rear of the cabin remembered a classmate who had been isolated simply because she looked different from everyone else. The lesson unfolding before them was no longer limited to this aircraft. It was becoming personal. The aircraft suddenly felt different than it had an hour earlier. Not because a chief executive officer had arrived. Not because an investigation had begun. Because a difficult lesson had become impossible to ignore. People were no longer seeing a conflict. They were seeing themselves. Marcus looked around the cabin one final time before turning toward the exit. Respect should never depend on a title, he said calmly. If someone only deserves dignity after you discover they are important, then dignity was never the standard to begin with. Nobody challenged him. Nobody could. The statement settled across the cabin with a quiet force that no formal announcement could have matched. Nicole closed her eyes briefly. The words hit harder than any disciplinary action. Because deep down, she knew they were true. Had she known from the beginning who Aaliyah's father was, none of this would have happened. The realization was impossible to escape. And that realization revealed the real problem. Passengers quietly stepped aside as father and daughter moved toward the front of the aircraft. Not out of fear, out of respect. The distinction mattered. Earlier, people had stepped aside because authority had arrived. Now they stepped aside because understanding had arrived. The afternoon sun poured through the open doorway at the front of the plane, casting long streaks of light across the aisle. Dust particles drifted through the golden beams. The scene felt strangely symbolic, as though clarity itself had entered the cabin. Aaliyah paused briefly before leaving and glanced back at the cabin one last time. Her eyes moved slowly across the rows of passengers, the crew members standing quietly near the galley, the witnesses who had spoken up, and the individuals who wished they had spoken sooner. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only reflection. She understood something many adults never fully learn. Carrying resentment rarely changes the past. Learning from mistakes can change the future. Then she continued forward beside her father. Behind them, the investigation would continue. Reports would be reviewed. Statements would be collected. Decisions would be made. Training protocols would likely change. Procedures would be reevaluated. Careers might be altered. Consequences would follow. But the most important outcome had already happened. An entire cabin full of strangers had been forced to confront the cost of a single assumption. Not a dramatic assumption. Not a malicious one. Just a quiet assumption made without evidence. The kind people make every day without realizing how much damage it can cause. Outside the aircraft, airport operations continued as normal. Ground crews moved baggage. Service vehicles crossed the tarmac. Other flights prepared for departure. To the rest of the airport, it was just another afternoon. But inside this cabin, something had shifted. A standard had been challenged. A blind spot had been exposed. And a lesson had been learned. As the aircraft sat motionless on the runway, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Character is revealed not by how we treat the powerful, but by how we treat the people we believe have no power at all. Because power can command respect. Titles can demand attention. Status can influence behavior. But genuine character appears long before any of those things become visible. It appears in ordinary moments, in everyday interactions, in the choices people make when they believe nobody important is watching. And by the time the truth finally arrives, by the time identities are revealed and titles are known, character has already spoken for itself. The passengers would eventually leave. The crew would face the consequences of their decisions. The reports would be filed and the reviews completed. Yet long after the aircraft departed and the details faded from memory, many of the people who witnessed that afternoon would remember one simple lesson. Every stranger deserves dignity before they earn recognition. Every person deserves fairness before they prove their importance. Because the greatest test of character is not how we treat people after discovering their value. It is whether we recognize their humanity before we know anything about them at all.